Welcome to Season 6 of Ancient DOS Games, everyone. Now, as I'm sure many of you are aware by this point, I'm terrible at strategy games, and I wasn't about to start off a whole season of Ancient DOS games covering a game I wasn't going to be so great at. So I decided to kick off this run of ADG with Lords of the Realm 2, which is a strategy game. Okay, let's be real for a second here. For as bad as I am at strategy games, I can still typically play through enough of them to get an idea of how well they work in terms of functionality, user interface, AI, and just gauge how well the game feels overall, even if I lack the skill to make decent progress in them. Besides, this game's kind of an anomaly when it comes to strategy games in general. Normally when you think of sequels to strategy games, you think more features, more content, more complexities. Well, Lords of the Realm 2 is actually kind of the opposite. It has a ton of maps you can play the game on, but in terms of content and features, it's been streamlined and reduced slightly from the original game, yet otherwise plays exactly the same, albeit with a stronger presentation using an isometric perspective instead of an overhead view, at least outside of combat. Now, the streamlining kinda made the game a little easier for me to play, and I was actually able to win a round on one of the easier maps against a low-level AI opponent. But yeah, this game's still way outside of my comfort range. But hey, the guy who sent this my way really wanted to hear my thoughts on it, so here we go.
Your violation of our borders is an outrage. You will pay for these bully boy tactics.
As with the original, Lords of the Realm 2 was developed by Impressions Games. However, this time they had it published through Sierra Online in 1996. Now, I should point out that DOS was not the intended platform for this game, and nowhere is this more apparent than the lack of multiplayer here in the DOS version, limiting us to a one-player strategy game, whereas the Windows version supports up to 5 players at a time in a networked or modem-connected multiplayer, which is still a curious reduction from the 6 players possible in the original game. It only supports SVGA 640x480 256 color graphics, but has a fairly wide range of audio support, including something called NV digital audio, which I didn't know how to classify because I wasn't sure what that was referring to. And possibly something NVIDIA related, as they were certainly around back then, but no idea what specifically. As for the game's current release date, it's still commercial, and the Windows version can be obtained from the Good Old Games website as a package with both the DOS and Windows versions of the original game, as well as the expansion, altogether for $6, or if you don't want the original game, the sequel and its expansion can be bought together on Steam for $3. I should point out, the lack of DOS executables tripped me up last year, because I intended to cover this game sooner, but hit a roadblock when I found out I only had the Windows version. Which seemed weird because the actual CD for the game contains both the DOS and Windows versions. Though now that I know multiplayer only works in Windows, I'm not quite as surprised by this anymore. So if you'd rather grab a physical copy either for collecting or to specifically play the DOS version, well, that might get a little annoying. Well, don't get me wrong, finding physical copies of the game is easy, but finding the specific copy you want for a decent price, that's going to be tricky, as there was the original release in box, the Siege Pack expansion, as well as the Royal Edition and Royal Collection, which are both effectively the same thing, including the original game, second game, and expansion all in one box. Plus he had a separate Mac release as well. And the prices for all of these are just all over the place, as some sellers are trying to gouge over $100 for this stuff, while the more sane prices seem to be more like $20 to $30 for a fully boxed copy of any of these. None of these releases are rare. Not at the time of making this video anyways, so if you're patient, just wait out the better prices if you're wanting a physical copy. This game technically has a story, but it really isn't much of one. Basically, the king has been killed and now 5 of his nobles are vying for control of the kingdom. The knight, the baron, the countess, the bishop, and the player themselves, who remains unidentified as the game never intends to run without the player being involved. Now, something I want to point out right away is that the opening cutscenes are actually interlaced. If not for some editing magic, this is how you'd be seeing them right now. Now, curiously, only the opening cinematics are like this, and all the cinematics in the game itself are not interlaced. Stranger still, though, is that these cinematics have stuttering. Like, I don't mean the game engine stutters trying to play them, I mean stuttering has literally been recorded into the cinematics themselves. The stutters happen the exact same way at the exact same points every single time. I can't say I've ever seen something like that before in pretty much anything, and I'm kinda having trouble envisioning how you'd even accomplish recording a game cinematic in such a manner, given that it's all pre-rendered 3D. Anyways, let's talk gameplay. When you start the program up, you have a choice between playing now, loading a game, or starting a custom game. The play now option is basically how you start up a special 8-round campaign, playing across 8 predetermined maps, with the difficulty getting progressively harder every step of the way. The custom game, however, is basically the equivalent of a skirmish mode, where you play any map you want and set up all the details of the game's rules and starting stats. Given that the Play Now feature has no difficulty selection and always progresses you through the same maps, the custom mode is probably what you'll be playing the most of, outside of multiplayer in the Windows version. You then go straight to this screen here, and with your first time playing, you'll also have some help pop-ups enabled, giving you some basic advice as to what you can do. This screen is where about 80% of the game takes place, as you'll be scouting the map and managing your lands from here. Again, the gameplay is very similar to the previous game in the series, so instead of focusing on what's the same, let's focus on some differences. And one of the big differences right off the bat is this slider right here. This is one of the ways the game's been streamlined from the original game, in that instead of having to manually adjust every single allocation of your townspeople to various duties, which you can still do if you want to, you can instead just use this slider to divvy them up automatically between farming tasks and industry tasks, with farming tasks including tending fields, cattle ranching, or reclamation of fields which have become unusable for whatever reason, while industry tasks include foresting, mining, quarrying, smithing, and castle building. You can also turn industries on or off for a particular county by clicking on them on the map, which reallocates everything accordingly. Now, this streamlining is kind of a double-edged sword. The plus side is that it makes the game far more approachable for the average person. But the drawback is that the method used to manually divvy up the jobs has been made overly convoluted to compensate for the changes. And when you click on a town center, you can see each of the various tasks split up into 9 different sections, with the middle representing people who aren't doing anything at all. You don't have exacting control over every townsperson with sliders. Instead, you click and drag boxes to select units which represent multiple townspeople, then click on the task you want to assign them to. You'll then potentially see some of the people you moved sitting down, indicating they're unnecessary to perform the task at maximum efficiency, or you may also see black shadows indicating a task requires more people in order to be performed correctly. Now, before I forget, I do want to draw attention to some advanced options the game provides, which you can turn on or off as desired during the campaign mode, but are locked during a custom game or multiplayer. These advanced options are Advanced Farming, Army Foraging, Exploration, and Fight Humans Only. The Advanced Farming varies how many people it takes to tend the farms, as well as grain output, whereas regular farming uses fixed values for this. Now, crop rotation is handled automatically in this game, so you don't have to worry about that. Army foraging makes it so that armies need to eat food, and thus draw from the available food for whichever county they're stationed in. Exploration is essentially a fog of war, thus blanking out the map and revealing more of it as you explore. The last option, Fight Humans Only, sets whether the AI will fight other AI-controlled characters, or whether the AI will only fight other actual players. Continuing the streamlining, a couple aspects have been removed from the game compared to the original. Sheep and Axemen army units. Now, Axemen were a bit too similar to Macemen, thus they were ironically axed from the formula, though all the other unit types are still here. Sheep just sort of overcomplicated everything, so the only animals now are cows. Also, when you deal with merchants now, everything is always available. The only trick is keeping track of where the merchants are on the map. If they're not in a county you have control over, you won't be able to purchase anything. And when you hover over something available from the merchant, you'll see both the buy and sell prices, with the sell price typically being half of the buy price. You'll also notice all kinds of pertinent information available at all times now, all ready to be adjusted in an instant, including taxes, food rationing, population levels, health, and happiness. Though it's easy to misidentify where you are and which stats you're reading. The game's supposed to automatically adjust these based on which area you've scrolled the camera to, But with small or unusually shaped counties, the game gets confused and will frequently indicate stats to adjust for the county you're not looking at, in which case you can just click on the county you want to focus on in the top right to be certain. A more unusual change is that all players play at the same time now instead of taking turns. Now, this was a fairly uncommon practice for strategy games with a separate battle element because it meant if two players engaged in combat, other players wanting to do combat with one of those players would have to wait until the battle was over. Now, the top of the screen shows colored shields to indicate which players still have their turn active, and the seasons don't change and the status of everything doesn't advance until all players have ended their turn. Actually, I ran into an interesting conundrum related to this. When I first started recording footage for this video and tried to end my turn, it, well, just sat there. And I could still click on stuff, I could still mess with things, but the end turn option was gone and the game wasn't doing anything. I was really confused for numerous minutes on end, until I took a second look at the game speed setting and noticed it was somehow set to 0, which didn't make any sense at all, because I took a look at that value earlier in a test game prior to recording, and it was very much not set to 0. So I have no idea why it somehow mysteriously got set down like that. But yeah, the game won't progress at all if the game speed is set to 0, so if you run into the same issue your first time playing, be sure you check that. Speaking of the combat, let's talk about that next. It's fairly similar to the previous game, though much easier to engage in, as you simply click and drag to select units, and then click where you want them to move or who you want them to attack. Though the game's not very good about positioning. In fact, it's so bad about positioning that I found the AI could be goaded into all sorts of poor decisions and took extreme advantage of this, especially when considering that a moving unit isn't capable of attacking. Thus, whoever is stationary will always have the advantage over whoever is moving. And the AI knows this and will only leave a stationary position when they feel they have no choice. Now, just like with the first game as well, you can lay siege to castles using this real-time battle system. But that also relates to one aspect of the game that's kind of been severely cut back: castle building. The original game offered a huge degree of custom castle designing, which would then factor into combat, but in this sequel, you have only 5 preset designs you can choose from, and that's it. Now mind you, they're not bad designs, but come on, building your own castles was half the fun of the original game. Plus, I should point out, it's really confusing what's solid, what's a door, and what's elevated when you look at these castles during combat, and this tripped me up during one of my sieges against one of the more advanced castle types. Yeah, there's not really much more to say about this game, especially given that beyond everything I've already mentioned in this video, it plays pretty much exactly like the first game in the series. Now, a comparison of reviews showed that this game is considered to be the better game over its predecessor, though I think it's more accurate to say this game looks nicer and is more accessible than its predecessor, meaning more people will be able to play this one successfully due to the streamlining and simplified aspects. If you want the most detailed and complex mechanics possible, then you're better off playing the first game. But still, both games are decent, so that's really a matter of preference. For me, the second game is easier for me to play than the first game, but both games still annihilate me sooner or later. Strategy really isn't my forte. So I actually need to recommend against playing the DOS version in DOSBox and going for the Windows version instead. Not only because of the addition of multiplayer, but because the speed is much more consistent. This game is highly sensitive to speed changes in DOS and will play too fast if you set the cycles to auto or max, will play at a poor frame rate if you set a low fixed cycles count, but will also run into overspeed issues if you set a higher fixed cycles count, causing severe frame rate drops and sound stuttering during moments of the gameplay which are not speed critical, such as when menus pop up or cinematics are playing. All that said, I found a fixed cycles count of 60,000 to be the best balance, but even this wasn't optimal. If you'd prefer a lower frame rate over sound stuttering during certain moments, 30,000 would be a better cycle setting. Again though, the focus was clearly on the Windows and Mac side of things, not DOS. That's why this DOS version does feel neglected. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. As for the new format for Season 6, next Saturday will be the first ADG Pro video ever, and we're going to be investigating the stat balancing in a particular fighting game to see just how balanced it truly is. So make sure you stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching, everyone, and extra special thanks to everyone supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small selection of you guys.